The smell hit you the moment you walked through the front doors. Floor wax, chalk dust, and something else underneath it all, something chemical and faintly metallic that you could never quite name but never quite forgot. These are 20 things built into American classrooms that would trigger federal investigations, emergency evacuations, and criminal charges today. And the first one on that list was right there above your head, every single day, quietly doing its damage. Number 1, teachers smoking cigarettes at their desks while students were present. And it was a practice so common in mid-century American schools that children simply accepted it as part of the landscape of adult authority. The teacher sat at the front of the room, chalk in one hand, cigarette in the other, and the smoke drifted back across 30 small faces in a room with windows that were usually shut in winter. Some teachers smoked through the entire lesson. Some used the ashtray on their desk the way other teachers used a coffee mug. It was simply there, always in use. The children had no choice in the matter. The concept of secondhand smoke as a measurable health hazard to people nearby was not yet part of public understanding. And even as that science emerged, school policies were slow to respond. Today, it is almost incomprehensible. In 1957, it was Tuesday afternoon. Number 2 is lead paint, and it was on the walls, the window frames, the radiator casing, the wooden desks, and the doorways of American classrooms from the early 1900s straight through the 1970s. It was everywhere, and it looked perfectly normal, cream-colored, pale green, institutional tan, the same colors you associated with authority and order. Lead paint was prized for its durability. It held up to scrubbing and scuffing and years of small hands dragging across it. What it also did was chip. Old paint always chips. And children picked up those chips. They ran their fingers along peeling windowsills and then touched their mouths. They breathed in the fine dust that floated from freshly sanded walls during summer renovation work. Lead accumulates in the brain. It damages neurological development. Entire classrooms of children were sitting in rooms that were quietly impairing their cognition, and no one connected the dots for decades. Number 3 is mercury thermometers in science classrooms. They were standard equipment for most of the 20th century. Science teachers handled them the way you might handle a pencil, casually, without ceremony, without protective gloves. When the thermometers broke, and they broke regularly against hard laboratory benches, the mercury pooled on the tabletop in bright silver beads that rolled and merged and split apart again, in ways that seemed almost alive. Teachers sometimes wiped it up with a paper towel. Students pressed their fingers into the beads just to feel the strange weight and cool resistance of a liquid metal. In some classrooms, broken thermometer cleanup was treated as a minor inconvenience rather than a hazardous materials incident. Today, a single broken mercury thermometer in a school building triggers a hazardous materials response, parent notification, and professional decontamination. In 1963, it triggered a sigh and a damp rag. Number 4 is coal and oil furnaces. They were running in the basements of American schools long after cleaner heating alternatives became available. On cold mornings across the Midwest and the Northeast, you could smell the furnace the moment the bus pulled up. The older buildings had no modern ventilation. Fumes from incomplete combustion drifted up through floor grates and settled in the lower air of the room, the air where children sat. On the coldest days, when the furnace was working hardest, that smell thickened into something that sat at the back of your throat. Teachers sometimes cracked a window, not because anyone told them to, but because the air felt wrong. Carbon monoxide has no smell and no color, and it does not announce itself. What it does is accumulate. Schools running on those old systems had no carbon monoxide detectors, no automated shutoffs, and no air quality monitoring of any kind. Number 5 is open stairwells with no fire doors. They were designed into American school buildings as a matter of standard architectural practice for most of the 20th century. The logic was flow. Thousands of children moving between floors multiple times a day required open, unobstructed movement. What the open stairwells also provided was a perfect chimney for smoke. In a fire, heat and toxic gases rise, and an open stairwell draws them upward through every floor of the building in minutes. Many older schools had a single stairwell serving the entire structure, meaning one fire on the ground floor could cut off every classroom above it in moments. The Collinwood School fire in Ohio in 1908 killed 172 children and teachers, and the open stairwell was listed as a primary factor in the death toll. Buildings constructed after that tragedy still repeated the same design. It took decades of updated fire codes to change it. Number 6 is lead pipe drinking fountains, and they stood in the hallways of American public schools for most of the 20th century. Children lined up at them every single day between classes without a second thought. The pipes that fed those fountains were often original to the buildings, soldered with lead, running through walls that had not been touched since the school was constructed. In older buildings, the lead content of the water coming out of those fountains was, by today's standards, a public health emergency. Lead has no taste in water. It has no smell. It does not change the color or the temperature of what you are drinking. It simply enters the body and stays there. Children who drank from those fountains for years were receiving a steady, low-level dose of a neurotoxin with every sip. The damage was real. It was measurable. And for decades, no one tested the water. Number 7 is wooden fire escapes. They were bolted to the exterior brick walls of American school buildings well into the middle of the 20th century. On older city schools, you could still see them rotting in place decades after they should have been replaced. They were painted, usually dark brown or black, and from a distance they looked solid enough. Up close, the boards were soft, the bolts were rusted, and the railings moved if you leaned against them. A wooden fire escape is also a fire hazard in its own right, a structure made of the same material as the fire it is meant to help people escape. In a real building fire with smoke and panic and hundreds of children pouring out of classrooms at once, those structures were inadequate in ways that became tragically obvious in the disasters that proved it. Today they exist only in photographs. Number 8 is single-exit classrooms. They were the norm in American schools built before World War II, and many of those buildings remained in use through the 1970s. One door, one way in, one way out. The logic at the time was security and supervision. A single entrance made it easier for a teacher to control who came and went. What it also created was a death trap. Modern fire codes for school construction require at least 2 points of egress from any occupied room. The reason those codes exist is not theoretical. They come from records of school fires where children were found stacked at the only door, because the hallway beyond it was already burning. In a classroom full of 30 children, one blocked exit is not a procedural violation. It is a sentence. Those codes did not appear out of caution. They appeared out of consequence. Number 9, asbestos ceiling tiles. They were in nearly every American public school built before 1980. Most children who sat beneath them had no idea what they were looking at. The tiles were gray or cream-colored, pressed and pitted with tiny holes, running in long rows from the front of the room to the back. They were chosen for fire resistance and insulation, and engineers considered them a modern solution. What nobody told the teachers, the janitors, or the children was that every time one of those tiles cracked, every time a ceiling pipe shifted, every time a maintenance worker drilled into the wrong spot, microscopic fibers drifted down into the air of the room. They were invisible. They were odorless. And they lodged in lung tissue where they stayed for the rest of a person's life. Today, a single compromised asbestos tile triggers professional abatement protocols, mandatory school closure, and federal notification. Back then, the janitor swept up the crumbles and moved on. Number 10 is exposed electrical wiring, and it ran along the baseboards and the upper molding of classrooms in older American school buildings. In some buildings, it ran right across the plaster walls and metal conduit that teachers used to hang things from. The wiring in many of these schools was original, knob and tube installation from the early decades of the 20th century, never updated, never inspected, running underneath layers of paint and plaster. Where it was visible, it was simply part of the room. Children who sat near the walls sometimes reached out and touched the conduit the way they touched everything in their environment. Out of curiosity, out of habit. Frayed insulation, corroded connections, and overloaded circuits in those old buildings were responsible for school fires across America for decades. The electrical infrastructure was not a background detail. It was a live hazard humming quietly at the edges of every school day. Number 11 is inkwells built directly into the surface of wooden school desks, and they were a fixture of American classrooms from the 19th century through the mid-20th. Even as fountain pens gave way to ballpoint pens, the wells remained. Small brass-rimmed holes cut into the upper right corner of the desktop, filled with black or blue chemical ink. Children dipped their pens, dripped ink on their fingers, and, as children do with things they are not supposed to touch, they explored it. They smelled it, they mixed it with water, they occasionally tasted it. The fumes in a closed classroom where 30 inkwells were open on a warm afternoon were not trivial. Today, those desks are antiques. The chemicals that filled them are classified. Number 12 is flammable window shades. They hung in American classrooms throughout the early 20th century. In the older schoolhouses, they were still in place long after fire safety standards should have forced their removal. The shades were treated with oil-based coatings to make them opaque, and those coatings were, under the right conditions, highly combustible. Direct afternoon sunlight concentrated through a south-facing window could heat a shade enough to become a concern. An open flame from a science demonstration, a drop match, a chemistry experiment gone wrong, any of these could ignite a shade which would burn fast and fall burning onto whatever was below it. Fire inspectors in school buildings from this era found shade material that failed basic flame resistance tests in room after room. Replacing them cost money, and for underfunded school districts, the danger sat there hanging at every window, waiting for the wrong afternoon. Number 13 is the boiler room, used as a detention space, a practice that sounds almost too punitive to be real, but it was documented in numerous school districts and is remembered clearly by the men and women who sat in them. The school boiler room was hot, loud with the grinding and clanking of old heating equipment, poorly lit, and filled with the smell of fuel and rust. In some schools, it was simply the available space because no dedicated detention room existed, and the basement offered the combination of isolation and adult supervision that the punishment omopsant was meant to convey. Asbestos-wrapped pipes ran along the ceiling. The air was different down there. Children who were sent to sit in that room for an afternoon were exposed to conditions that would today constitute an environmental health violation, and the practice would invite immediate regulatory scrutiny and potential criminal charges against school administration. Number 14 is the complete absence of accessibility for disabled children. It was built into American public schools as a structural fact of life before the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975. Before those laws, a child in a wheelchair was simply not expected to attend school in a building that could not accommodate them. Children with physical disabilities were routinely excluded from public education entirely, placed in institutions, kept at home, or offered a fragment of schooling in whatever ground floor room happened to be accessible. The assumption embedded in those buildings, in every set of stairs without a ramp, in every restroom with a door too narrow for a wheelchair, was that certain children did not belong there. The architecture said it plainly. It took decades of advocacy and the force of federal law to begin dismantling what those buildings had been built to express. Number 15 is concrete playgrounds with no padding, no rubberized surfacing, and no fall zones beneath the equipment. And they were standard at American public schools through the 1970s and into the 1980s. The injuries they produced were a routine part of childhood that everyone accepted without question. The jungle gyms were metal pipe, painted red or green, bolted into concrete footings with bars high enough that a fall from the top meant landing from 8 or 10 feet onto a hard surface with nothing to absorb the impact. Broken arms were common. A broken collarbone. Head injuries. Teachers who supervised recess watched children fall and assessed from a distance whether the child was going to get up. If the child got up, the recess continued. The falls were not considered a design failure. They were considered a lesson. Today, that equipment on that surface would violate Consumer Product Safety Commission guidelines at every American school in the country. Number 16 is chalkboard dust, and it filled the lungs of teachers and students in American classrooms for over a century. In the days when the eraser was cleaned by clapping two of them together, a job typically assigned to a student as either a reward or a punishment, the cloud that rose was thick enough to make you cough. Chalk is calcium carbonate and fine mineral gypsum, and the dust particles it generates are small enough to penetrate deep into the respiratory tract. Teachers who spent 30 years at a chalkboard, writing and erasing and writing again in rooms with minimal ventilation, were exposed to cumulative inhalation levels that researchers have since linked to chronic respiratory irritation. The children who cleaned erasers by smashing them together outside the classroom door were doing so with no respiratory protection, faces directly in the billowing cloud. It was considered a privilege. It settled in the bronchial passages like chalk on a slate. Number 17, formaldehyde-soaked specimens stored in open glass jars on classroom shelves. They were a fixture of biology education for most of the 20th century. The smell of a room that contained them was unmistakable and immediate. Preserved frogs, fetal pigs, cow eyes, crayfish, earthworms. They sat on open shelving in their cloudy solution. When students crowded around a lab table for dissection, the jar was right there, open, releasing fumes into the air of the room. Formaldehyde is a known human carcinogen. Prolonged exposure at elevated concentrations is associated with nasopharyngeal cancer and leukemia. The levels in a poorly ventilated high school biology classroom with a dozen open specimen jars were not measured because in that era, no one was measuring them. The specimens were educational. The ventilation was whatever came through the window. The exposure was simply the price of taking biology. Number 18 is exposed raw sewage pipes in school basements. These pipes were part of original infrastructure in many older American school buildings throughout the 20th century. Often made of cast iron or clay, they ran openly beneath unfinished basement ceilings without enclosure. Cracks and seepage were common in aging systems, and the bacterial contamination from a leaking sewage pipe in an enclosed basement space was a direct health hazard to anyone working or exercising in that room. Gym class held in a basement beneath exposed plumbing was not a historical curiosity. It was a documented reality in the histories of schools across American cities, remembered by students who dressed out in those rooms and tried to breathe through their mouths until the period ended. Number 19 is ceiling-mounted radiant gas heaters installed directly above student seating. They were common in American schools, particularly in portable classrooms and older rural school buildings from the mid-20th century onward. The proximity of those heaters to children sitting beneath them was a slow, persistent hazard. The units were designed to mount high on the wall or flush against the ceiling and radiate heat downward. In portable classrooms with low ceilings, the clearance between the heater surface and a standing child could be measured in feet rather than yards. The units ran on natural gas or propane. Malfunctions such as cracked heat exchangers, incomplete combustion, or failed ignition sequences produced carbon monoxide. In a sealed portable classroom in January, with windows shut and the heater cycling on and off, the air quality was entirely dependent on a piece of aging equipment that nobody inspected on any regular schedule. Number 20. DDT was sprayed inside American school buildings during pest control visits, and it happened well into the 1960s. In many cases, the application took place while the school was occupied, or just before students returned to their classrooms, with no waiting period and no ventilation protocol. DDT, dichlorodenphényltrichloroethane, was the dominant pesticide in post-war America, considered so safe and so effective that it was sprayed in schools, hospitals, homes, and military barracks without protective gear and without warning. The exterminator arrived, the classrooms were treated, and the children returned to sit in rooms where the chemical residue had settled on desks, on floors, on the surfaces where they placed their hands and their faces. The Environmental Protection Agency banned DDT in 1972 after research definitively linked it to cancer, endocrine disruption, and severe environmental damage. The children who sat in those rooms in the decades before the ban were not warned. They were simply present. Those school buildings are mostly gone now. The ones still standing have been gutted and retrofitted until almost nothing of the original interior survives. The lead paint is encapsulated or stripped. The asbestos has been removed at enormous cost. The electrical wiring has been replaced. It is easy, from the distance of the present, to look at that list and see only negligence, only carelessness, only a time when nobody thought hard enough about the children inside those walls. But it was also a time when people believed in good faith that they were building something solid, permanent, and good. They were wrong about the materials. They were wrong about what was safe. And the generation that grew up inside those buildings, that breathed that air, drank that water, sat beneath those ceilings, carried more home from school than anyone intended. They carried it in their bodies, and some of them carry it still.